I saw what I believe was a Sasquatch, roughly 5 years ago. I was 16 years of age and volunteering as a counselor at a day camp. A friend and I went for a walk on the trails within the camp. We were cleaning the trails, and we had also brought our lunches with us, which our plan was to eat later. We were on the outskirts of camp, maybe half a mile at most from the main camp area, very close to the Malala River. I was roughly 60 feet from a muddy creek, kind of a swampy area. I remember sitting down to eat lunch. My friend realized that he had left something back at the camp, and he really needed it. I can't remember what he went to get. Maybe a tool or something to drink. Anyway, he left. I remained seated on a log, waiting for him to come back. I expected the jog to take maybe, a whole 10 minutes at most. At this point, he had been gone for at least 7, and I'd heard something in the woods off to my left. I stood up to try and get a better look at what it was. What I observed was a massive, hairy, man-like animal standing next to a large tree. I believe it was cedar. It was about 50 feet away. I estimate that it was roughly 8 feet tall. I stood about 5'9". At the time, it was far taller than I. It was also very wide and bulky looking. The fur was thick and fairly long, maybe 6 inches, and medium brown in color. It looked directly at me for a few moments. We had solid eye contact. Its eyes were dark, very dark. It seemed to be shocked or surprised and was almost deciding what to do, based on the expression on its face. It stepped to its right, or my left, behind the large tree, and immediately it began to run away. I could not see it run away because the tree blocked my view, but I definitely heard it. It sounded very heavy. The footsteps could be heard clearly. It was snapping down branches as it ran, creating a lot of noise. It sounded very powerful. I listened to it run away for maybe 10 seconds. Then, I turned around and ran back on the trail towards camp. I ended up meeting up with my friend on his way back to meet me. I was also the only person that had actually witnessed the whole event. Since my friend was on his way back from retrieving something from the main camp as I'd waited, I may have been snacking on some of my lunch. Also, I have heard recent stories about a mother and a daughter in Beaver Creek, Oregon, who had apparently encountered Sasquatch, but I don't know any of the details. Beaver Creek, though, is not too far away from Malala, within the same county. My roommate and I were driving along Highway 224 between Carver and Barton at approximately 10 p.m. We saw a pair of eyes reflecting in the darkness on the river side of the road. We frequently went to visit a cicada at night to go see a friend working at the safari club. We actually lived across from Rock Creek sand and gravel at the time. I lived in the immediate area all my life. As we got closer to the reflection, I could see a creature standing near the road behind some maple limbs. At first, when I saw the eyes, I assumed it was just an owl. When we went by it, I saw a creature from approximately chest to the top of head, with limbs obscuring the lower body. The color was very dark brown, its arms at its sides, and it stood there, looking as we drove on by. I didn't say anything for about a mile or so, and then asked my roommate if he had seen something along the highway. When he answered yes, I knew we weren't crazy. So, I asked him what he saw. He told me the same as what I saw. We decided to go back the next day in daylight to try and check out the area, to see if it's ultimately possible the whole thing could have been real. While there were no clear tracks, but there was definitely a trail crossing the highway to the river, from a swamp and bluff. On top of the bluff, it would have been somewhere between Damascus and Boring. The limb that we saw the creature behind was about 6.5 feet tall. Now, 2 or 3 years prior, a friend of ours who lived on Gronland Road was scared by a creature while walking home late at night. He saw it somewhere between Carver Bridge and Baker's Cabin. Anyway, he said it scared the heck out of him, and he ran the rest of the way home. I never used to really believe in hairy people before I saw it myself. I would, however, like to see one again. I was bow hunting and had parked myself between 2 separate deer trails, each running alongside a clear cut. I was dead center, 25 yards between me and each trail. I faced west, into the wind, at roughly dusk. There was usually a lot of deer in the area, but on that evening, it seemed very quiet. Just as it became too dark to see my aiming sights, I heard crunching footsteps coming from directly behind me. At the time, I thought it might be a buck and rut. The animal seemed to be following my scent directly to where I was hidden in some blackberry bramble. A cover scent had been applied to my clothing and boots using pine needles that were blended with water. My clothes were soaked in the solution and dried. Very effective, for deer anyway. This animal, though, walked upright, right to the clearing behind me. I had plenty of time to turn around and situate myself for a clear shot. I raised my bow, and it came into view 25 yards away and stopped. It seemed to know exactly where I was sitting. We were staring at each other from a distance of about 75 feet for roughly a full minute. The Bigfoot slowly swayed back and forth a few inches from side to side. If I had to estimate, it would be roughly 7.5 feet tall, possibly 600 plus pounds. I never pulled on the bow, and the Bigfoot eventually turned around, walked in the same direction it had come from. Due to the thick foliage and leaves on the ground, no tracks were found the next day when I had returned to look around. This animal was black in color. Its shoulders were approximately 4 feet wide. Since this incident happened, I've brought up this subject with many people in the area, and am surprised at just how many have had, or know somebody who has had, experiences in this county alone. If you're ever in the area, look me up. We can take a trip into the Cascades here behind my home. I'll show you Bigfoot. Right off the bat, I'll tell you, I'm a 16-year-old kid, telling absolutely the truth. So God strike me dead if I'm lying. I hope you don't take my report as bogus because of my age. Now, let me explain my situation to you. I live and have lived on the Molalla River for the majority of my life. Never thought twice about walking around at night, or anywhere, period. About 2 months ago, I was alone in my grandmother's house, using her computer. I decided to go home. My house is only about 50 yards away. As I was stepping outside, the most hideous feeling of being alone and fear thumped my heart. I kept walking in terror when all of a sudden, about 30 feet off to my right, I hear a loud thumping and some crash. From there on, being distorted by my act of running faster than I've ever moved before, I could swear I heard the distinctive two-legged footsteps veering towards me from off the trail between the houses. I raced in my house, slamming the door, locking it, sitting there in the living room, trying to calm down from my strange experience. The oddest feelings flushed through me then, and now. Before you dismiss my story as merely a frightened child running from noise, I'll have to tell you of the strange past of our 45 acres of land at the end of the Dickey Prairie Road. Now, around 3 years ago, when we had cattle and cows fenced on our property, I noticed casually how they would always stay together and go near the barns at night. One day, we had discovered 2 of them killed up in the woods by the drinking creek. The killings weren't average killings either. The cows did not have a single scratch on them. Both had broken necks, and their eyeballs sucked cleanly out. Since those experiences, I'm now scared to go hiking and traveling at night. Yes, average signs of fear, but I have the weird feeling of being an intruder. Thank you for your time, sincerely. Also, I am a believer. One other thing. When I was in 4th grade, my friend Heather and her brother were taking out some garbage when they claimed they saw a giant white monkey walk up the hill and away from the trash cans. They only lived about 5 miles away, but moved to Texas about 6 months after that happened. It apparently scared them so badly, they slept with their mother and dad in fear. And about 5 years ago, I had heard that some big investigators came to look at some tracks right across the Malala River from where I live. Very interesting, if you ask me. Before I go any further, I would like to emphasize that I'm not sure that I actually heard a Bigfoot sound. I'm mainly putting this on here because I have thought about it in depth, which is why the delay in reporting. And the only thing in my memory that has any resemblance at all to what I've heard is the past audio recordings of Bigfoot, although what I heard had better audio. I still wonder if this was a Bigfoot. How or why it would have been near a town, I have no explanations. I was in Sandy, Oregon, with my family during the weekend of July 21st to the 23rd, back in 2000. We were staying at the Sandy Inn, just west of the main part of town. It was hard to sleep at night of the 21st. It was very humid. There were some thunderstorms moving through at about midnight. I was up and down several times during the night, either to shut the window, open the window, turn on the AC, etc. I got up once, right around 3 or so in the morning, on the 22nd, after the storms had passed. I was sticking my head out of our second-story window, enjoying some cool air and kind of looking off into the woods toward the north. There was not a sound anywhere that I could hear. No cars on the highway, nothing. Then, I heard a very indescribable sound. I thought at first it was tires screeching, but as the seconds passed, I realized a car would have to be burning rubber for a long ways. Then, as I kind of cleared my head, I thought it sounded like a man screaming, or better yet, wailing. But I have never heard a human do a sound like that either. It was not a moan or a howling with an ooh sound. It was more like a yay sound, very high-pitched. It won't do me much good to try and interpret the sounds and the phonetics, but the way the pitch of the sound went up and down so fast, the way it modulated in pitch and tone, I have never heard any other animal or human make this sound. I've heard quite a lot of animals. If a human did what I'd heard, they'd bust their vocal cords. This went on for roughly 20 seconds, maybe a little longer, but not sure of that. It did seem to kind of trail off at one point and then come back. I know it was long enough for me to get a good listen, if not close by. The window faced toward the north, so it's possible that that's where it came from, but I can't be too sure of that. It seemed like it was off in the distance somewhere. When it started, it was rather quiet, and ended trailing off in the same manner as it started. Even though I was a bit groggy, it was weird enough to wake me up and even scare me a bit. I didn't think too much of it at the time, but the next morning, I was thinking to myself, what was that? I didn't report it or consider that until now. I wasn't sure, and after a while, I had honestly forgotten about it until something in my mind triggered it again. All I can say is if it was not a Bigfoot, fine, but please, tell me what it was. Near the end of August, this year, 2008, a couple of friends and I went camping / Bigfoot hunting around the upper Kallawash River in the Oregon Cascade Range east of the Estacada, with the intentions of finding a spot that I had been told about by a guide on a whitewater rafting trip. I had taken this back with my brother in 2006. Unfortunately, when we got to our destination, I was the only one in our group that wanted to look for Bigfoot. Disappointed, but not dissuaded. I had tried to keep the rest of the group, 2 guys and 1 girl, at least someone interested in the Bigfoot search. To little avail. The first night we camped, under much protest, quite a way into the bush, and away from the overcrowded campgrounds, where everybody felt much more comfortable. We followed an old logging road until it ended at a very secluded stop, right on a ridge, maybe 350 yards, directly south of the clear-cut power lines running east and west. That first night was interesting. We continued to hear distinct wood-knocking sounds. They started up, right around 11 p.m. Most were far off and very fast. 4 to 7 quick, sharp cracks, directly east of us, echoing across the valley, only to be answered by another direction farther south and then north. But at first, they were pretty far off. Everybody thought they were gunshots, but this was a really dark night, and these sounds were coming from pretty deep in the thick forest, accessed only by not well-traveled logging roads from at least 3 different sources, and that, for the life of me, sounded like they were communicating. So, I ruled out gunshots. Now, these sounds continued to get closer to our campsite as the night wore on. At one point, maybe around 12:30 or 1 in the morning, the group wanted to drive over to the power lines, where the trees weren't so thick, and you could see for several miles. I, personally, decided to stay at camp and hope for something to happen. Almost immediately, after everybody else left, I began hearing sticks breaking from the direction they'd driven out on. Everything got really quiet. Now, I'm from Montana, and have spent many nights camping alone in a far more rugged terrain and mountains than I was in now. I've experienced most of the wildlife, at least partially, up close and personal, that our American forests have to offer. But I gotta tell you, I got a little spooked while they were gone. I did what any self-respecting outdoorsman would do, and put a lot more wood on the fire. I did not hear anything at the time. It sounded too bizarre, and I was glad when everybody got back. My buddy asked me if it was knocking rocks together while they were gone, although I told him I had not, and asked what they had heard. He said they were out looking at the valley from the top of the road we had came in on, about 250 to 350 yards away. They had all heard distinct knocking coming from the direction of our campsite. He claimed it sounded like a rock on rock. Later, after everybody had retired to their tents, I again decided to stay up. At around 3:30 a.m., I heard a very low grumble with a huff, followed by what sounded like a lot of breath being pushed out, very close to the fire, maybe 30 feet. It was dark brown or black, uniform in color, at least 9 feet tall, moving like a freight train. It was huge. We only saw it for maybe a second before it tore into the trees, running from right to left. My skeptical friend looked at me and said, "Did you see that?" I had my video camera in my lap, but there was no way that I could have gotten a shot of this thing. It was really moving. We stopped where we thought it crossed, and you could see quite clearly where something had come down the incline on the right side of the road. We didn't smell anything, though. We got out, and I climbed the small incline that had come down to investigate. After 30 or so minutes, I found a barefoot track, 18 inches long and about 7.5 inches wide. I got video of it. I can send the video and have other stories of the area as well. We did have material with us to cast the print, but it was mossy on the ground, and so my buddy refused to cast it, claiming we wouldn't get anything from it. I was furious, but it was his stuff. I learned the hard way. Always pack your own gear. Okay, I'm 34, so what I'm about to tell you, I'm still having trouble accepting. I've wondered about this since I was little. Now, I know. August 25th, 2009. My girlfriend, her 2 boys, and I went camping at my usual spot. This location was picked due to the isolation factor. It's 10 miles up logging roads near Estacada, Oregon. I will not disclose the GPS coords, or even close to the proximity. This is my spot. Nothing abnormal occurred over the day or night of the 24th, and the day of the 25th was normal. Things like gathering wood for the coming night, all the normal things. We had put the boys down for the night, just after sundown. We were sitting around the fire, chatting and poking the fire. Being who I am, I began making a noise to hear it echo through the trees. You know, rooster noises and some whooping. Basic idiot noises. The time was approximately 11:30 p.m. I do this at times to keep bigger game from coming through camp. Well, I got one heck of a shock about 15 minutes later. We're walking back toward the fire from the truck. The fire was only bright glowing coals at this point. And boom, shock to the system. Out of the pitch black night, one of the most unreal sounds I have ever heard in my life came rushing through the dark. It was a hair-stiffening scream, and at that moment, I could not match in my memory of noises over the 20 years I've been going into nature to escape. This was indeed the first time in my life that I felt the need to get out of nature, quickly. The sound pushed through the trees, like the trees were not even there. Even the air around us seemed to vibrate. From experience, I have had in the woods through my life, and tracking sounds and distance. I'm estimating that this scream was being produced about 200 yards away. It was so loud, nothing I knew of could make this big a noise. There's no animal I've come across that has lungs to produce such a loud, long, vocalized sound as this creature produced. Let me put it this way. If somebody told me they had heard it, I would be trying to put a canine responsible, but hearing it myself and knowing of nothing I've encountered can make that sound. Now, I did not stand there much longer. I think I may have pushed my girlfriend up into the truck so I could get in ASAP. As soon as I was in, the lights were on, the horn going for about 3 seconds to try and keep it from getting closer. It seemed to work. The volume began to fade a bit. We decided to get camp up and get out. Over the minutes it took us to completely tear down the camp, maintain a track on movement of the screams, and shove camp into the truck. This screaming continued and moved. From the time it started, it was about 2 o'clock from camp. While we were packing up, it moved clockwise around to about 5 o'clock. This all took about 30 minutes before we were on our way downhill. The screams continued even on our way out. To make it completely clear, I've done a lot in my life. Anything from solo hunting at the age of 12 up until my time in the military. I've never been spooked, even with rounds whizzing past. But that scared me to the point of every hair on the top of my toes to the top of my head were at attention. Now, after the fact, realizing what it was, yes, I'm going back there with recording gear. And let me tell you, after 34 years of just now experiencing what I did, has completely changed my thinking process while out here in the woods. The main river in this area and the surrounding county can be a double-edged sword. A vast wilderness, smacked up against a major population, Portland, Oregon, with numerous rock quarries used to create the logging roads. At times, the shooters make the canyons sound like a war zone. But as soon as playtime is over and evening sets in, people head back down the hill, and the war zone transforms into a more serene and mysterious place. Booms and blasts are a place with the sounds of winds blowing, birds chirping, and camp conversations. When night falls, another reality becomes very quickly apparent. This area has one of the highest instances of Sasquatch encounters in the entire country. Like many, I have reviewed much evidence online, from word of mouth, all the while wrestling with a degree of skepticism. This is not my first experience with this group leader, but it would prove to be my most memorable to date. We arrived at camp somewhere about 2:30 to 3 p.m., set up, and planned for the night's scouting. As the sun set and dusk turned to dark, the group leader gathered us all together. Having sized up the territory and considered several scenarios, he shared his thoughts about the night's approach. A particularly important point he mentioned was that it was vital to remain flexible and open to the possibility of modifying our plans if new evidence presented itself. So, the initial direction was decided and tactics clarified. He had selected an old closed road farther up the ridge, up against the beginning of the older growth, probably second growth timber. Access to the road had been blocked years before by a berm, impossible for cars, yet fairly easy to traverse on foot. It was roughly midnight as we crossed the berm into what can only be described, based on everybody's sudden change of mood, as somebody or something else's world. The wind had finally all but stopped, and it was now deathly quiet, except for the crunching of rocks under our boots. The brightness of the waxing moon lit the landscape, and our company in shadowy shades of black and gray, with silvery highlights. Our shadows were black and well-defined. One gentleman of our 5-man team, a young veteran of Middle East war, proudly clad in his fatigues, walked point, followed by the group leader and his son. I was next, having made sure to place myself as close to the middle of the company as possible. And finally, the oldest man in our group picked up the rear of the column. I think that older gentleman understood the value of being last, increasing the chance of being selected for contact. The old road cut across a slope near the top of the ridge. Below, a steep drop-off, choked with new undergrowth, rhododendron, and an assortment of other lush Western Oregon varieties of undergrowth. Above us, a dark, shadowy strand of old trees, silvery snags strewn throughout the forest floor, the wild, most rugged terrain the area can offer. We approached a large dead tree that had fallen across the road, as each in the company climbed over the log, signaling yet another barrier into another world. The group leader stopped. He had been carrying a tree knocker, and now he would put it to good use. It was time to announce our presence. The group leader let loose with 2 sequences of knocks. Pop, pop, pop. Then, pop, pop. Each hit, echoing through the forest, rebounding off steep canyons with the force of a home run. We all had enough experience to stay completely quiet and wait for a possible response. No crunching boots, no wind, dead quiet. After a couple of moments, we moved on. The older gentleman was the first to hear a response, a soft tap-tap. He stopped the group for a listen. The first contact had been patrolling us from below, down the hill in the thick brush. We stopped and listened. Nothing, and then continued on. I began nervously glancing back down the road behind our column. I couldn't help but wonder if I might catch a brief glimpse of a dark figure slipping quietly across the road, back up into the timber. We then came to a bend in the road. There was a wide turnout, covered with ground cover. Our eyes had continued to adjust, so the moon now lit up our position on the landing, like a large streetlight. Just as my mind was focused on all of this, and when I least expected it, the real knocking began. At that moment, reality changed forever, and everybody was transformed. All eyes, all thoughts, all senses were now directed toward the dark timber. Not 50 feet away, the knocking continued. There, among the old trees, a shadowy figure, an intelligence controlling a hand with an opposable thumb, wielding possibly a large stick, sending knocking sounds echoing through the dark cathedral forest. The knocking pattern seemed to be a coded message, letting us know that whoever or whatever it was knew we were there. The army vet turned to me. I could still remember the excitement in his eyes as he exclaimed, "That's no woodpecker." And I replied, "This is real." I heard my name and quickly turned to see the rest of the group on the ground, the group leader quietly ordering me to get down. There, we sat as the group leader exchanged sounds and words with a creature that I now realized, for the first time in my life, was 100% real and just 50 feet away. Every one of us felt the rush of being fully alive and acutely present. During these moments, nothing else seemed to matter. I asked myself, can this really be happening? The group leader's words may not have been understood, but his calming tone must have spoken volumes to the figure or figures behind the tree line. We felt, as they must have, that neither was there to threaten the other. The knocks were not aggressive, simply a way to let us know they were there. Once the group leader thanked them for allowing us to share their space, he suggested that it might be time to retreat and not push things any further. We began hiking back toward the car. It soon became apparent our progress was now being flanked, and so it was. With glowing yellow-green and red eyes, vocalizations, and rustling all the way back to where we had parked. The following night would reveal further why we had been so closely monitored. Once back, we were abuzz. We realized that we had all just been transformed, born again. Nothing would ever be the same.